They didn't expect the dog to stop. Not in front of her. A line of Japanese women stood in silence outside the barracks, their faces drawn tight with suspicion. Then the Hound, a mottled stray the soldiers called Reckless, padded out from behind the mess hall and sniffed his way down the row. He paused, looked up, and sat beside her. The soldiers chuckled. One leaned on the fence and said it like a joke. He picked her. But what happened next, when Reckless returned the next morning and the next, wasn't a joke. It became something no one could quite explain. The guards watched in silence. The prisoners watched in awe. She, the nurse with a stitched arm and an empty stare, slowly began to change. And as the dog returned again and again, with gifts, with gestures, with something like loyalty, the women in the camp began to wonder, if the enemy's dog could choose kindness, what else had they been wrong about? The women stood still, like carved stone under the weight of the midday sun, their shadows long and rigid against the dust. The Hound, broad-shouldered and patchy-furred, moved with an easy lope through the camp's open yard. He passed the mess hall, where cigarette smoke hung like a veil, and skirted the perimeter of the barbed wire fence, pausing to sniff a bent spoon left near the gate. One of the guards called out his name, Reckless, half laughing, half warning, but the dog paid him no mind. He moved toward the women. He had done this before. Reckless wasn't trained, not really. He had arrived with the Texans a few months back, a half-starved stray they'd found near a railway line in Luzon. Someone had tossed him a bit of bacon, and, like any good soldier in war, he stayed where the food was. In time, he became part of the unit. He knew the lunch bell, the guard rotation, the path to the cook's waste barrel. He barked at storms and chased butterflies with a solemn purpose. He wasn't beautiful. One ear hung limp, and his ribs still showed if the light caught him wrong. But the men loved him. They swore he could tell when a man was lying, when a man was scared, when a man was about to cry. None of them expected him to walk straight toward the prisoners. The line of Japanese women, maybe 24 in all, had only just arrived that morning. Their transport truck still reeked of diesel and fear. The women had been told nothing, marched from the train station with blindfolds on. Whispered rumors passed between them like poison. The Americans would brand them, beat them, do things that should not be spoken aloud. One woman had bitten her own tongue bloody rather than cry when the guards shouted at the gate. But the shouting never came. The guards were quiet, methodical, even strangely detached. One handed out water. Another gestured toward the latrine. There was no yelling, no mocking. Still, the women stood tense, stiff, silent. They waited for the cruelty to begin. And then the dog. Reckless walked past the first woman. She didn't flinch, but her eyes followed him like a rifle scope. He passed a second, a third, sniffed the air once, then stopped. It was the fifth woman in the line, slight, arms crossed tightly across her chest, hair pinned back with trembling fingers. The Hound sat down in front of her, stared, and then slowly lowered his head onto his paws. The silence broke. One of the Texan guards chuckled and slapped his thigh. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, not unkindly. "He picked her." The other women turned to look. The fifth woman, her name not yet known, didn't move, didn't blink. For a heartbeat, it was as though the entire camp had frozen, held breathless by the quiet gravity of the moment. Then Reckless thumped his tail once. Just once. No one knew what to say. The woman didn't bend, didn't reach, didn't acknowledge, but something in her jaw slackened. Her fingers unclenched. The guards shrugged it off, eventually. Dogs are dogs, after all. But that night, As the prisoners were led into their barracks and the guards smoked beneath the watchtower, someone noticed Reckless curled beside the same door where she had entered. His eyes were closed, ears twitching in the breeze. "She fed him," one guard guessed. "No," said another. "He just picked her." And then, more quietly, "You think she's the one?" They meant it like soldiers do, half superstition, half joke. But the next morning, Reckless was there again, sitting outside the same door, waiting. The women noticed first, then the guards, and then, over the next weeks, so did the rest of the camp. The dog had chosen, and he would not be swayed. Hannah did not understand it. She had not spoken, not moved, not even made eye contact with the creature, and yet it had chosen her. The mutt had laid its head at her feet as if it belonged to her, as if it had known her before. That evening, while the others whispered across the dim barrack in dialects from Nagano to Osaka, Hannah sat still on her bunk, staring at the crack between the floorboards. Beneath her blanket, her fingers were still trembling. Not from fear, from something stranger, something she hadn't felt in months. Presence. In the final days of the war, Hannah had worked in a field hospital carved into the belly of a jungle hillside in the Philippines. The air was thick with rot, blood dried black on uniforms. Her hands had moved without instruction: stitch, disinfect, bind, inject, over bodies too broken to save. They had run out of morphine by the second week. She was ordered to lie. "Tell them it's medicine," her superior had said, handing her water in a rusted canteen. "They'll believe you more than me." By the time the gunfire grew closer than the screams, Hannah no longer listened to the wounded. The surrender came not with an explosion, but with silence. A white flag draped across a stretcher. An American voice shouting something unintelligible through the trees. Her commanding officer took his sidearm, bowed toward the rising sun, and pulled the trigger through his temple. Hannah did not look away. They were taken, those who survived. Women, mostly. Nurses, typists, communication auxiliaries. Captured not with chains, but with a kind of stunned detachment. She remembered being lined up on a dirt road, her palms bleeding from brambles, her shoes long gone. One girl next to her sobbed so hard she vomited. Hannah had simply stood there, back straight, her body humming with shame. They had all taken the same oath. Better to die than surrender. Bushido, they were told, was not just for samurai. It was in the blood, inherited, sacred. To be taken prisoner, especially as a woman, was to forfeit the right to return home. She had known this, accepted it. Her family would never speak her name again. She did not expect kindness. She expected to disappear. Yet now she found herself sleeping on a mattress, thin but real, with a blanket not covered in mud but smelling faintly of soap. The guards barked orders, yes, but not with rage. They handed out food, not fists. And outside the barracks, every morning, the dog. Reckless, they called him. She had heard the name murmured by the men. One of them, with a thick accent, laughed when he said it. Reckless, the damn fool dog. But the dog wasn't foolish. He was deliberate. Every morning, as the women filed out for roll call, Reckless waited near her. He didn't bark, he didn't beg. He simply existed beside her, as if her presence made the world make sense. Hannah didn't pet him. Not at first. She wasn't ready. Her fingers had been taught to close, not open, to sterilize, not comfort. Even when one of the guards tossed him a scrap of meat and the dog carried it over and placed it by her feet, she only looked at it. But something inside her shifted, a small, almost imperceptible thaw. The other women noticed. They whispered, curious. A few laughed, as if the dog's behavior made Hannah ridiculous, but she wasn't listening to them. Inside, she was still in the jungle, still rinsing blood from bandages, still waiting for death to feel like honor. The dog did not know Bushido. The dog did not know shame. The dog did not care what she had done or what had been done to her. He simply chose her, every day, and in a world where everything had been ripped from her, language, country, purpose, that choice began to matter. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough that, for the first time since her capture, Hannah looked up when the morning bell rang, and when she saw the dog waiting near the barracks door, tail curled at his side, she felt something else begin to stir inside her. Not pride, not hope, something simpler. Recognition. It was the first thing she saw when she stepped into the morning light. The dog, already waiting. The sky above the compound was soft with clouds, pale streaks against the dawn, and the earth beneath her sandals still cool. The other women were already forming into lines, their shoulders hunched from cold or memory, but Reckless didn't move. He was sitting exactly where he had been the morning before, his head tilted slightly, watching her as if she were late to something sacred. This time the guards didn't laugh. One of them, the younger one with the faded freckles and the drawl, only gave a short nod. Another adjusted his rifle strap and said nothing. The novelty had passed. What remained was something quieter, stranger. Suspicion clung to the camp like humidity. The women did not trust the guards. They did not trust the food, the beds, the blankets. They especially did not trust the silences. Silence, after all, could be the stillness before cruelty. When the Americans offered letters home, few took the paper. When they handed out cigarettes, most were hidden or broken into pieces to test for poison. Even kindness, especially kindness, felt like a weapon. So, when Reckless sat beside Hannah a second time, it was not received as entertainment. It was received as uncertainty, something unpredictable in a place where control, even the illusion of it, mattered more than warmth. The other women watched, their eyes flicking between the dog and the guards, waiting to see if it meant anything, if it was a signal, if it was bait. But the dog just sat there, for hours. Through morning assembly, through a brief inspection, even through the light work detail in the gardens, he stayed near her. When she was told to sweep the path along the barrack fence, Reckless trotted alongside her like a shadow. When she knelt to clean the water bucket, he curled in the shade of the guard tower, his breathing slow, content. No one asked her to explain it, but everyone noticed. That afternoon the heat grew thick, pressing against the wooden walls of the camp like wet cloth. The sun was a white glare overhead, and the women were allowed a short break near the edge of the mess hall. A few sat on the grass, knees drawn up, faces blank. Hannah found a spot beside a stone slab and lowered herself down slowly, wincing as her back ached. Reckless followed. He lay beside her without invitation, head resting across his paws. His eyes closed, but his ears twitched every few seconds. Listening, always listening. She sat with her hands in her lap, her elbows tucked in, as if afraid to take up space. She could hear the murmur of the guards in the distance, the low hiss of something frying in the kitchen, the clatter of a dropped fork. And then, nothing. A stillness that stretched long enough to feel like a question. That was when she moved. Just her hand at first, slow. Her fingers hovered above the dog's back, shaking slightly. She had not touched anything, without gloves in months, not without intention, not without need. She didn't know what drove her now. Only that her hand moved down, gently, and settled on the warm, coarse fur of Reckless's spine. The dog didn't stir, but his tail wagged once, her breath caught. The fur was warm, real, alive, not like bandages or bedsheets. It didn't demand anything from her. It simply existed beneath her palm, anchoring her in the present, in a world where everything had felt like fog and distance. That simple act, touch, cracked something open inside her. She did not cry. Not yet. But she left her hand there longer than she meant to, and when she finally pulled it away, she curled her fingers inward, holding the warmth against her skin as if it might vanish. No one saw. Or if they did, they said nothing. But the next day, Reckless came again, and this time, when he lay beside her, she did not hesitate. Her fingers reached for him before her thoughts did, and that, more than any letter, any food, any whispered comfort, was the first true sign that something inside Hannah had begun to return. The smell came before the bell, rich, meaty, heavy with onion and slow-cooked potatoes. It drifted through the camp like something forbidden, curling past the barracks and settling in the hollow spaces between ribs. For a brief second, Hannah thought she had imagined it. Then the women around her began to shift. Nostrils flared, eyes darted. No one said a word, but the silence itself became expectant. Stew. It was the first time they had served it since her arrival. Not watery broth, not tasteless slop, but real stew, thick and fragrant. Even before the call to mess was sounded, Reckless stirred from his place by Hannah's feet. He stretched, yawned, and patted ahead, as if he knew where she was going. She followed slowly, her steps cautious, uncertain if the food would taste like it smelled, or if it would betray her in some quieter way. Inside the hall, the trays clattered like distant gunfire. The line moved slowly. She could feel the presence of the other women, their shoulders tense, their eyes flickering toward the windows, toward the guards, toward anything but each other. A few held their trays with stiff arms, too proud or too afraid to let them tremble. One whispered, "It's too much," as the cook ladled the stew into her tin. Another said nothing, only stared at the bread roll like it was a relic from a dream. And then Hannah stepped forward. The cook didn't look at her the way her officers once had, like she was something to be scolded or ignored. He was a squat man with gray at his temples and grease on his apron. When he filled her tray, he gave her a nod. Not approval, not pity, just acknowledgement, as though she existed. She sat at the end of one of the long tables, away from the others, near the wall. Reckless settled beside her again, his head resting lazily on his paws. His tail gave a single thump, like punctuation. The stew was steaming, thick with chunks of carrot and something that looked like beef. The bread was warm. Not fresh, exactly, but soft enough that it bent in her hands. She hesitated. The smells collided with old memories of miso boiling in her mother's kitchen, of the rice porridge from her first posting in Manchuria, of the emergency rations near the front lines that tasted like dust and metal. She had eaten to survive. She had swallowed pain with every bite. Hunger had become a language of loyalty, but now, in this strange place, surrounded by supposed enemies, she felt something shift, and then, Reckless, looked up at her. Not begging, just watching, waiting. She tore off a piece of bread, not to share, not yet, but to test it. It melted against her tongue. No poison, no lie, just bread. Then the stew, salty, rich, heavy. The warmth spread down her throat, into her belly, and something inside her cracked, almost like laughter. She didn't smile, not outwardly, but her shoulders dropped. She took another bite, then another. And then she was eating, not with desperation, not with shame, but with permission. Around her the other women noticed. One by one they shifted in their seats, glancing at her, then at the dog. One leaned forward and dipped her spoon into her own tray. Another broke her bread roll and stared at the steam as if it told her a story. No one spoke, but the silence felt different now, less like fear, more like awe. Reckless remained still throughout the meal, a sentinel, a witness, a quiet permission slip curled at Hannah's feet. In a place built to contain them, to remind them of what they had lost, he offered something radical: ease. And as the women ate, the stew no longer tasted like surrender. It tasted like something older than war, something they hadn't felt in years. Home. They noticed before they understood. The guards, leaning against fence posts or sipping lukewarm coffee outside the watchtowers, began to go quiet when she passed. Not in the way men grow quiet out of mockery or malice, not the silence of judgment, but something more reverent, almost uncertain. They stopped calling out jokes to each other. They stopped nudging one another with raised brows. Even the ones who'd once made easy quips about the dog's lady friend now averted their eyes or offered a respectful nod. No orders had changed. The rules remained the same. Follow Geneva. Don't fraternize. Stay sharp. Stay separate. The men had been briefed from the start. These weren't combatants. They were nurses, clerks, support roles, but they had worn the rising sun, and that made them enemy. Enemy with manners, maybe. Enemy with pigtails, one corporal had once said, but still enemy. What no one had prepared them for was reckless. They all liked the mutt. Some of them more than their own bunkmates. The dog seemed to know when a fight was brewing, when a man had nightmares, when he needed space. Reckless had slept beside more than one man's bunk during a fever. He'd followed a soldier into the rain after a Dear John letter and simply sat beside him until the shaking stopped. But the thing that startled them wasn't what Reckless did for them. It was what he did for her. Hannah. They learned her name slowly, over time. No roll call ever announced it. She never introduced herself, but guards overheard the others whispering. "Hannah," they'd murmur when calling her for food or motioning her to the water line. The name clung to her gently, like the fabric of her worn uniform, no longer stiff with fear. And so, one evening, a blanket appeared at the foot of her bunk, thicker than the standard issue, not new but clean, folded neatly. No note, no ceremony. She didn't ask where it came from, but when she unfolded it, Reckless was already waiting beside the bed, tail brushing against the floor. The next day, one of the guards, the one with the crooked nose and the Arkansas drawl, walked past with his lunch in hand and tossed a small strip of bacon to the dog. Reckless caught it, trotted over, and laid it gently at Hannah's feet. The man didn't linger. He didn't look her way. But when she knelt to pick up the scrap and offered it back to the dog with her fingers, there was no hesitation. Only the quiet nudge of a wet nose against her palm. There were still lines, still uniforms, still weapons. But something had shifted. One afternoon, during laundry duty, a sudden wind caught a stack of folded shirts, scattering them across the yard. Before anyone could bark orders or react, Reckless was already moving, herding the clothes like a sheepdog, nudging them back into a pile. The women laughed. So did the guards. It was the first shared laugh across that invisible line of war. They began to look differently at one another, not as monsters, not as shameful, just as people, tired, surviving, trying. Reckless had no language, no allegiance, but he moved through the camp like a thread pulling two pieces of torn cloth closer together. He didn't understand Bushido. He didn't understand orders, but he understood presence. And every time he chose to lie at Hannah's side or to deliver a crust of bread or a stolen moment of quiet, The men followed his lead, not because they were told, but because somehow they knew. If the dog could trust her, maybe they could too. And if she could kneel in the dirt beside him without shame, maybe they could stop pretending they hadn't noticed her strength. And so, in the long heat of late summer, the war shifted slightly in that little camp, not in treaties or telegrams, but in glances, in offerings, in silence that no longer felt like distance, because the guards were watching. But for the first time, they were also seeing. But not all eyes that watched did so kindly. Among the women, change moved more slowly. Suspicion is a heavy thing, and heavier still when one carries it in silence. Most of them still lived inside themselves, folded in on old codes, shrouded in shame that no warm meal or nod from a soldier could soften. Some looked at Hannah with quiet awe, others with something closer to resentment. Not hatred, that would have required too much energy, but a tension, thin and sharp, that pulsed through glances and long silences in the barracks. That morning the dust lay thick and still across the yard. Reckless, as always, was by Hannah's side, tail flicking lazily as she swept near the garden beds. She was moving more easily now. Her eyes stayed open longer. Her shoulders, though still cautious, no longer pressed up to her ears. There was even a faint trace of color back in her cheeks, the kind that came from eating meals and sleeping through the night. Then it happened. One of the women, older, from Sapporo perhaps, no one was sure, knelt by Reckless. Her movements were quick, not violent, but purposeful. She grabbed at his collar, not harshly, but with a firmness that startled. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe envy. Maybe she wanted to test the dog's loyalty, to see if it could be earned, if it could be claimed. Her fingers tightened, and Reckless growled. It wasn't loud, but it stopped everything. The low, guttural sound cut through the morning hum like a blade. His lips curled, his eyes sharp now, no longer the sleepy companion, but something more ancient, a flash of teeth. The woman recoiled, gasped, fell backward onto the dirt, one hand flying up to shield herself. He didn't bite, but he could have, and that was enough. For a moment no one moved. Then Reckless returned to Hannah's side, circled once, and lay down with his back to the others. Hannah hadn't flinched, hadn't spoken. She only looked at the woman on the ground, her eyes steady, unreadable. Whispers rippled through the yard. "He picked her," someone said, "and this time it wasn't a joke." After that, something in the air changed. The women no longer tried to touch the dog, no longer questioned the bond aloud. Even the guards, hearing the story later, only nodded. One of them said, "Loyalty's loyalty, ain't no explaining it." Another added, "He's got more sense than most of us." That evening, when Hannah returned to her bunk, she found another blanket, this one newer, thicker, tucked neatly beneath her thin mattress. A small gesture, maybe, or a quiet apology. She didn't ask where it came from. She no longer needed to. She unfolded it slowly, hands steady now, and laid it across her cot. Then she knelt down, whistled once, a sound she'd never used before, and Reckless came, without hesitation, without pride. He curled at her side as she settled in, and when she spread half the blanket across his back, he didn't move. It wasn't just protection, now. It wasn't even gratitude. It was something older, tribal, perhaps. The kind of bond forged before language, when survival depended on knowing who would bleed for you and who wouldn't. The kind of loyalty that didn't ask questions, didn't seek reward. The camp, for all its fences and foreign rules, had become something else in that small, shared space. In the flicker of a growl, a folded blanket, a silent gesture, something sacred had been named. without words, and reckless, the mutt who had wandered into a war had drawn the line with his teeth, not out of anger, but out of love. For a long time after that, Hannah could not sleep, not because of noise or cold or fear of the dark. Those had long since lost their power over her, but because her mind would not rest. Something had shifted when Reckless had bared his teeth and chosen her all over again. It had given form to a truth she had refused to look at, that she was still alive, not in the technical sense of breathing and walking, but in the deeper way, in the way that required acknowledgment. It was the next morning, when the fog still clung to the fences, that the paper arrived. A guard left it on the table near the barracks door. A thin stack of lined sheets, a few dull pencils, a quiet offer that had been made many times before and refused even more often. The women gathered near, hesitant. Some stepped away immediately, as if the paper itself could burn them. Others stared without reaching. Writing home was dangerous. Dangerous because it reopened wounds. Dangerous because it meant admitting survival. In the culture they had been raised within, to be taken prisoner was already a kind of death. To write home was to deny that death, to expose oneself to judgment from families who had been taught that surrender was a stain that never washed out. Many of the women still believed their parents would rather mourn a ghost than accept a living daughter who had knelt before the enemy. And there was another fear, that the letters would never make it, that they would be intercepted, twisted, mocked, used as propaganda, twisted evidence of weakness. Hannah stood back, watching. Reckless watched her. He had followed her from the barracks, planted himself near the paper, his tail swaying slowly, steady as breath. He did not bark. He did not push. He simply looked at her with the same unyielding patience that had carried through days and nights and mornings. He did not care about shame. He did not care about what waited for her across the ocean. He only cared that she stood there, breathing. At last she stepped forward. Her fingers hesitated only a moment before touching the sheet. The paper felt too clean, too untouched by war. She sat on the wooden bench, smoothed it out, and picked up a pencil. It felt strange in her hand after so long, different from holding scalpels, bandages, needles. She did not write poetry. She did not explain the war. She did not confess guilt. She wrote simply, "Mother, I am alive." The words looked too small when she finished them. She stared at the space below, at the white silence that waited for more. Her hand trembled only slightly. "There is food here. I am not hurt. There is a dog." She paused at that line, not because it was unimportant, but because it carried more weight than the others. She could have written about guards, about blankets, about warm water. But those things felt complicated. The dog did not. The dog was simple, honest, and could not be mistaken for propaganda. A creature no government could invent, no general could weaponize, no doctrine could capture. "The dog is kind," she finally added. "Then nothing else. No apologies, no justification, no pleas, just the truth." When she folded the paper, her fingers were steady, and when she carried it outside and handed it to the guard with the freckled face, he noticed. "You sure?" he asked quietly, as if sensing the weight of what she was giving him. She nodded once. He didn't smile. He didn't salute. He only tucked it carefully into a leather pouch, as though it mattered. And it did, because inside that envelope was not just ink and paper, it was a rejection of silence, a quiet disobedience to the shame she had been raised to accept, a declaration not of pride, but of presence. Back in the barracks, the women watched her, some with surprise, some with envy, some with relief. A few, seeing the resolve in her eyes, stepped forward and took their own sheets. Not because the guards had ordered them to, but because something in her decision had loosened their fear. Reckless sat at the doorway, head lifted, as if guarding a gate that no one could see. And for the rest of the day, the camp was quieter than usual, not with fear, but with thought. That night, the sky hung low and cloudless. Stars pricked into the dark like wounds that refused to close. The wind had settled, and even the ever-present creak of the watchtower seemed distant. The camp was quieter than usual. Not the silence of fear, nor the sullen hush of waiting. It was something else, a stillness born of exhaustion, of reflection, of a weight beginning to lift. Somewhere near the east gate, the slow, lonesome wail of a harmonica broke the quiet. It was a tune without a name, one of those drifting melodies passed down from dust bowl towns or firelit barracks, worn soft by time like a stone in a river. The guard playing it, Private Lewis, was a boy, really, younger than most, with sunburnt cheeks, and a mother back in Kentucky who'd taught him how to play before he'd ever held a rifle. The first notes floated over the yard, tentative, and then, as though reassured by their own echo, they found rhythm. No one moved at first. The women, gathered in their bunks or by the fire barrels, glanced up slowly, uncertain whether this was permitted joy or another kind of trick. Music hadn't visited this place in weeks, maybe months. It felt like something that had to be earned. But Reckless stirred. He lifted his head from Hannah's lap, ears twitching. His eyes blinked slowly, as though the song reached him in a place deeper than thought. And when the harmonica slid into a sorrowful dip, low and haunting, he tilted his head skyward and let out a single wavering howl. Not loud, not sharp, just one soft sound, full of longing. The women froze, and then, as if something inside her had cracked, Hannah began to cry. It wasn't dramatic, no shaking shoulders or gasping sobs, just a single tear sliding silently down her cheek. Then another. Her face barely moved. Her lips didn't quiver, but the tears came steadily, unbidden, like water escaping a dam. The dog looked at her once, then leaned his head into her side. All around them the other women watched in silence, and something in the air shifted again. Because it wasn't just Hannah. One by one, eyes lowered, arms folded over chests, hands reached for sleeves, for something to hold. And then, in the quiet, another woman cried. Then another. Soft sounds, hushed breaths. The kind of weeping that had no room in war. The kind you hold back until something pure and simple, like a song or a dog's howl, reminds you what it means to feel. No one said her name, no one touched her, but they felt her grief as their own. Because Reckless hadn't howled for Hannah alone. He had howled for all of them, the silences they had carried, the homes they had lost, the words they could not write, the nights they had forgotten how to dream through. Private Lewis kept playing. He never looked toward the camp. He probably didn't know the impact his fingers were having. Or maybe he did. Maybe that was why he kept the tune slow, gentle, wide enough for every woman in the yard to step into, if only for a moment. And when the final note fell into silence, the night didn't rush back in. The hush that followed was not absence. It was presence. The guards didn't speak. The women didn't wipe their faces, and Reckless, faithful, strange, and somehow ancient, leaned into Hannah's side as if to say, I heard it too. If you're feeling this story, like the dog choosing her, the music, the quiet transformation, give this video a like and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us keep these hidden histories alive. The days after the harmonica night slipped by like breath on glass, seen for a moment, then gone. Something had lifted in the camp, but no one dared say it aloud. There were rumors now. Whispers among the guards, ships coming, orders being written, repatriation. The word didn't feel real, not yet, but it circled through the bunks like a bird trying to find a place to land. Hannah heard it too. The war had ended months ago. Everyone knew that. But for the prisoners, endings didn't arrive with headlines. They arrived in gestures, in hot stew without conditions, in guards who no longer flinched when handing out letters, in the way Reckless now trotted beside her with no one questioning it. That was how she knew something final was coming. Reckless had grown quieter, as if he sensed the shift, as if he knew that time, even here, was beginning to run out. And then one morning, the gates opened earlier than usual. A convoy arrived, quiet, gray, humming with restrained energy. A few American officers stepped out, flanked by medics. Paperwork followed, sheets stamped with names and destinations. Tokyo, Osaka, Sapporo, not all at once, but soon. The announcement was made formally, but the emotion behind it was not. There were no cheers, no outbursts, only silence. The kind that came not from indifference, but from shock, from not knowing who you were when your world, even a cage, began to dissolve. Hannah stood beside Reckless when her name was called. She nodded once, took the papers, and returned to her bunk. That night she did not sleep. Neither did the dog, and then, on the morning of departure, a guard approached her, the same one who'd once tucked a blanket under her mattress without a word. He held something in his hands. It was a collar. Leather, weathered, not new. A brass buckle dulled by time. It had clearly belonged to Reckless for years. The dog had never needed it here. He went where he pleased, loved by all. But the guard extended it now, not as a leash, not as ownership, but as a keepsake. "We figured you should have it," he said, voice rough. "You meant something to him." Hannah looked at the collar for a long moment. Then she shook her head. The guard blinked, surprised. Instead, she stepped past him, knelt down, and cupped Reckless's face in both hands. The dog, still and solemn, leaned into her palms. She pressed her forehead to his and whispered something, soft, low, in a voice no one else could hear. Not a farewell. A thank you, an apology, a promise. Maybe all three. When she stood, she left the collar in the guard's hands. She took nothing with her, no souvenirs, no fabric from the bunk, no letters, no proof that this chapter had ever existed. But she carried it anyway. The memory, the warmth, the howl under the stars, the tears that had finally come, the sound of a tail thumping beside her feet when the world had felt like it was ending. These were not things you could wear around your neck. As the truck pulled away, Reckless stood near the fence, not barking, not whining, just watching. His eyes followed her until the last moment, until the dust rose high and the gate closed again. And still he waited. Some said he returned to his rounds the next day. Others said he lay beside her bunk for hours before moving. No one knew exactly when he stopped waiting at the gate. But what they did know was this. Hannah had left empty-handed. And yet she had never been more full. The train to Kyoto arrived on a cloudy morning. Hannah stepped onto the platform with a bag of papers, a coat too large for her frame, and shoes given by the Red Cross that pinched with every step. She had not expected welcome banners or tears. She did not expect anyone to be there at all. She was right. The city she had known was half gone. Streets she remembered from childhood were now rubble or ash. The hill behind her school had collapsed from bombing, and her family home, once a narrow house with plum trees out front, had been reduced to a few blackened beams, barely enough to frame a memory. Her mother was still alive. Thinner than Hannah remembered, with hair now streaked entirely white, she lived with distant relatives in a crowded flat above a market stall. She greeted Hannah without ceremony, but with a deep, deliberate bow. Not of shame, not of joy, but of recognition, of survival. There were no questions about the camp, not at first. The silences in their house were thicker than the smoke that still hung in some streets. Her brothers had never returned, one presumed dead on a ship that never reached China. The other simply disappeared into the jungles of Luzon. And so they cooked rice when they could. They boiled tea leaves twice to stretch flavor. They lived. It wasn't until weeks later, when a neighbor visited and whispered behind her sleeve, that the first real question came. "You were in their camps?" she asked softly, as if even the word American might summon something dangerous. "Did they? What was it like?" Hannah didn't answer right away. She could have said warmth or blankets. She could have talked about bread or music or the quiet faces of men who handed her letters without demands. But all she said was, "There was a dog, and he chose me." The neighbor blinked, confused, then nodded as if pretending to understand. But that phrase, so strange, so out of place, lingered. Over the months that followed, other women returned, from camps in Texas, Idaho, Kansas. They told similar stories, never detailed, never confrontational, just fragments. "One of them gave me shoes. There was stew every day. They called me ma'am. There was a dog. They didn't organize. They didn't protest. But the stories, small as they were, began to spread, not shouted from rooftops, but passed over laundry lines and temple steps. Carried through whispers, they formed a kind of subversive current beneath the tide of public memory. A quiet contradiction to the official narrative that they had been tortured, broken, erased. No, the truth was harder than that, more complicated. They had been seen, not always, not by everyone, but enough. And Reckless, though none of the other women knew his name, became a kind of symbol, not a pet, not a mascot, but something older, a spirit that had wandered through war and found a place to sit beside the broken and the shamed. He wasn't just a dog, he was a POW choice. Their choice to remember not just what had happened to them, but what they had felt. Some never spoke of it, others wrote it in letters they never sent. But the impact endured, because in a nation torn between pride and ruin, silence and rage, there were women who carried a strange, unshakable truth, that, in the heart of captivity, they had been touched by something free. If this story moved you like this video, and leave a comment below sharing your city or country. Let's honor the quiet ways peace begins.